Welcome to the Biomesight podcast, hosted by Dr. Carly Polland, clinical lead at Biomesight. Biomesight is an AI-driven wellness analytics platform with a primary focus on the gut microbiome as a leading indicator of wellness. Biomesight practitioners and medical experts join us to discuss the microbiome and 16S rRNA sequencing as it relates to health. This podcast is intended for practitioners and patients alike. We are spreading knowledge and sharing resources so we can improve our microbiomes and health using the latest technology. Head on over to biomesight.com to purchase your stool test kit to discover your microbiome. Practitioners can register for a free account to get access to our gut microbiome analysis platform that supports FASTQ uploads from multiple labs. Please note this podcast series is not intended to diagnose or treat medical conditions. Ask your doctor before initiating any new treatments. In today's episode, we will be discussing the microbiome and autism spectrum disorder. Alex Zaharakis is a grateful husband and father of two beautiful children. His interest in the microbiome is driven by his son's regressive autism at 17 months after a culmination and spark of timely medical insults, several of which were microbiome-focused. Alex has devoted his spare time and efforts in researching and learning about the microbiome, helping other parents to navigate the biomedical and microbiome issues experienced in autism, to further development and improve outcomes. Alex is a licensed and board-certified radiation oncology physicist, a microbiome researcher that has created an analytical gut balancing model used by several doctors and practitioners growing in scope and use. He provides microbiome analysis using the software and model to members of his Facebook group who wish to participate in gut balancing. Over 100 autistic individuals have participated and over 200 other individuals through trained practitioners. Alex is currently providing biome analysis for the first two children of the FLIGHT study, a longitudinal type intervention for children with medical issues, which he has helped to raise money for. Alex is currently collaborating with an autistic research group that has focused on nutritional supplements, dysbiosis, and the efficiency of microbiota transfer therapy in the treatment of dysbiosis and autism. So, let's start with your story, how you have ended up using 16S rRNA sequencing to analyze the microbiomes of individuals with autism.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I wouldn't have really gotten into anything related to the microbiome if it wasn't for my son. So my son has a diagnosis of autism, and around the age of 17 months is when things started to kind of regress. And we noticed shortly around that time that he had some GI issues that were manifesting in kind of very loose and frequent stools, lots of diaper rashes. Even though that we were constantly, light speed kind of changing diapers. And we noticed some very odd kind of behaviors started to manifest with what seemed to be around the time that he was eating food. But later on, we kind of started to connect the dots that whenever he had a bowel movement, he would kind of get a bit zany, and he would get these very warm, kind of almost like fevers that would manifest at the same time of a bowel movement. So we knew something was kind of going on there. He had a history prior to that of lots of lots of antibiotics for ear infections and things like that. So after seeing different doctors and trying to kind of navigate the functional medicine piece, we noticed that even with small changes, introducing some probiotics and kind of diet restrictions that were ideal at that time, there were changes not only in kind of his bowels, but his mood, his cognition, his motor coordination, function, and stuff like that. So it was a long journey after that period. And it wasn't until I think we did our first Biomesight test when I saw that the data was allowed to be provided kind of in a numerical quantitative way, and I kind of have a background in analytics, so I thought to myself, well, maybe there's a way to exploit some of this and leverage that. So that's kind of the impetus for my involvement. Um, Really, prior to that, I had no background in microbiome components. I'm a medical physicist, so I have some kind of medical training, but I think the last thing that I would ever thought to have been involved with anything kind of bacterial or biological related in that sense.
Hmm. Since then, you developed your software system where you're analyzing the microbiome. So tell us more about how that works and how you're analyzing the microbiome.
Yeah, so I think if you look out there, the thing that's most frustrating and it can be confusing is that there are so many answers and a lot of them contradict each other in terms of what's the ideal microbiome and what you should be doing or what tests you should be doing and what intervention could be helpful and um, it introduces a lot of kind of speculation and anxiety for people that just kind of want to get help and I saw a couple of microbiome tests for my son, but then happened to have a group that I was, providing some support in terms of ideal things for people on the spectrum, and I got the ability to see some other stool tests, and it became very apparent to me that um, the problem or the dysbiosis seemed to be kind of if I were to paint a picture, you were looking to you know buy a home or shop for a home, and I use this analogy a lot. Everyone has their preference in terms of what the ideal home should be. What it should look like, how big it should be, but there are certain basic things that I think everyone would agree upon what a home should have. It needs to have a roof, it needs to have a front door, it needs to have a toilet, it needs to have a kitchen. Um, and in looking at some of these tests, it was really apparent that there was a lot of that stuff kind of missing, or there was things that were significantly out of whack, and it wasn't always the same thing. Um, so I started to do this manually and trying to kind of, you know, pick out what would be the biggest insults. And I became privy to this citizen science database, which at the time I was using, but I uh, currently have a much larger database. And my thought was, well, if I ever kind of visited another country and I didn't know what the language was and I didn't know what the customs were, how do I know that if I take my shoes off, that isn't like an insult? Well, I think the easiest way to kind of fit in is just do what the guy in the middle is doing, right? You walk into your lunchroom at school, there's this table at this end that's kind of rowdy, and then there's a cool table over there. Just kind of fit into the middle, and more likely you're going to kind of stay out of trouble.
Hmm.
Um, so my approach basically is leveraging that broad population and looking at the median value for different microbes and using that as a mechanism to um, gauge where to go when we encounter a microbe that we might not know a lot of information about. And certainly there's ones that are well studied and we have an idea of kind of good or bad, but there's a lot of them that, we really don't have an idea of what normal is. So I'm leveraging that guy in the middle as being a less unhealthy place.
Hmm.
And that's essentially what I'm doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely, there's no consensus in the research on what a healthy microbiome is. And I think whenever we finally get there, there will be a lot of individuality. And I think a healthy microbiome will look different for different people. So it makes sense in the meantime to just kind of, yeah, shift things more towards the middle and, and focus in on a couple of those key areas that we know are important from the research. So I imagine like Proteobacteria and LPS producers and butyrate producers and probiotics are probably an area that you're looking at because we have some solid research that those are important factors. Um, so to
Cer-
that end, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, certainly there are certain things that show up to, kind of consistency of like offenders, if you will. And focusing on them is essential. And then there's these couple of odd situations where you'll have a single species taking up 20, 30, 40, 50% that you might not have thought of to test for on another
Yeah.
test. And I think that's where the advantage of doing one of these 16S tests lies, because you're sequencing the entirety of that DNA in the V4 region for these microbes, the bacteria and archaea. So I think that's where you kind of get a little bit of a legs up
Yeah.
than another test that might just look at the 10 or 15 kind of major things.
Yeah, for sure. So, what patterns are you seeing in the microbiome of people with autism?
So it's that same kind of thing where there's a lot of different ways that you can have a home kind of fail, right? You need to have all these essential things for it to be livable in. But I would say the most common um, things that I see, I certainly see a deficit of bifidobacterium um, practically in everyone.
Hmm.
Um, I would see that there's elevations often of things like you said, Proteobacteria. There could be deficits of Faecalibacterium and Prosnitzi. I often see, quite commonly this overgrowth of Prevotella copri. In many of the samples, oftentimes you'll see elevations in the Clostridium genus, and Sutterella is another genus that
Mm-hmm.
I often see their lack of lactobacillus. I often see that. And just overall, like, the if you kind of totaled up the major butyrate producers, it usually is kind of a deficit that they have some kind of imbalance. They're shifted towards some other short chain fatty acid.
Hmm. Yeah, that all makes sense to me. I was interested in talking more about the butyrate producers because I saw some research studies were suggesting that Faecalibacterium and Blaudia were actually higher in people with autism. And that doesn't quite make sense to me because we know butyrate as anti-inflammatory. So I was just curious about your experience with the butyrate. And it sounds like you're more often than not seeing it on the lower end.
Yeah, I certainly I would say that the more non-ideal cases, you see it at a deficit or non-existent, and I've certainly come across some where the Faecalibacterium prosditzi kind of takes off and you know is somewhat overgrown, and I would tend to say that in those individuals, they're kind of in a better place, both biome wise
Yeah.
or kind of metabolically functioning. I think butyrate's really important, but I think there's a whole host of other things that contribute or can send you on that metabolic dysfunction pathway. I think the form of the butyrate is also important too, and one of the forms that I think that has been quite helpful is sodium butyrate. It seems that that has the ability to kind of get into the blood-brain barrier a little bit
Hmm.
better, and even supplementing with it. There's some literature that shows that it helps to reduce ammonia,
Hmm.
which seems to be elevated, kind of in different, almost like pulses or surges that kind of scale with the GI cycle. So I think butyrate's really, really helpful. Um, if you can generate it, naturally, I think that that goes a long way because then it kind of trends to a better balance. But even supplementing with it might be helpful as well.
Yeah, that makes sense because the butyrate produced in the gut, like the majority of it is going to be used by the gut. And I think the research suggests that only about like 2% will actually make it to systemic circulation. So, yeah, if we wanted the brain to get butyrate benefits, then supplementing and absorbing in the small intestine, that would make sense for sure.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to talk about proteobacteria. So, it sounds like you're seeing Sutterella as a common overgrowth for the proteobacteria. So let's talk about that for a minute, and then I want to talk about hydrogen sulfide producers. So what kind of levels of Sutterella are you seeing?
I've seen it at high. I want to say I've seen it as high as like 4%
Mhm.
of the entire sample. Typically I don't like to have it anywhere higher than like 0.3%
Okay.
of the total sample, but oftentimes you'll see it around the 1 or
Yeah.
2% range. It I often see it kind of pair with actually Prevotella cocci
Okay.
a lot of times. So I think that there's some common either synergy there or maybe some common dysfunction going on at the same time. There's another common theme that I see is desulfibrio is often implicated. I would say more than Bilophila, and I think
Yeah.
there's some literature out there that actually
Yeah.
has characterized that particular genus in the regressive autism as a paper. I
Yeah.
think.
I think I found that. Yeah, I definitely saw that in the research there, noting higher desulfovibrio. And so that's a hydrogen sulfide producer, and that's inflammatory. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, yeah, it implicates motility, that kind of sulfur metabolism going on there. Certainly the hydrogen sulfide gas, what havoc that potentially is wreaking on the body.
Hmm. It's interesting with the Sutterella because so I'm not working with the autism community, mostly autoimmune patients, and I do see Sutterella coming back high quite often. And what was surprising to me is that, and maybe this is just, lack of information on my part, but previously, years and years ago, using like PCR testing and all that kind of stuff, you'd be thinking about like, oh, maybe Klebsiella or E. coli, those kind of proteobacteria would be elevated. But the most dominant proteobacteria that I'm seeing in most people is Sutterella. I'm typically seeing it kind of at the 1 to 2%, even when the proteobacteria is under 4%. So that was just kind of surprising to me that Sutterella seems to come up a lot for different populations.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to some of the older type testing and the limitations there.
Yeah.
Like, with the culture type testing, you really have a lot of variation with heat and temperature
Yeah.
and the time that it takes the sample to get to the lab, but also the culture medium that you're using to kind of grow it. You're kind of assuming that these bacteria are going to grow these bad guys that you want to culture to measure at the same rate or in the same medium. So it really, I mean, my personal view is that you could probably, culture your desk and see Klebsiella out there. But the nice thing is that a lot of the proteobacteria tend to respond to some of the same kind of interventions. I
Yeah.
think Sutterella is a little different.
Yeah.
One of the things I think um, lactobacillus paracasei I found to be quite effective in bringing it down.
Mm.
But I think that a lot of times people will ask me those questions. Oh, where's the Klebsiella or where's the
Yeah.
Citrobacter frundi? And the way that I kind of look at it is I say, hey, let's just get the Proteobacteria phylum down
Yeah.
as low as we possibly can, and we know some things that kind of generally work on that phylum. If you want, you can kind of look and peek to see if it's in there, but it certainly doesn't register as high as you might see it on some of those older type
Yeah.
tests.
Yeah. That's what I found too. Um, so let's talk about some of the probiotic species a little bit more. So you're finding typically lower lactobacillus.
Yeah, I would say it's either near 0%. And I guess there's some debate on how much you should actually have.
Yeah.
Certainly lactobacillus seems to have a protective role. It seems to be implicated um, in kind of the tryptophan pathways
Mm.
and immunity. But I would say almost always it's either near zero or very close to, maybe 0.1% or 0.01% or
Hmm.
0.02% of percentage abundance. Sometimes you'll see, and you'll have to kind of filter out for this. There's a lactobacillus regressive, which is kind of this like imposter lactobacillus. There's,
Mm,
it's really misclassified in the to be into that genus. So sometimes you'll see the entirety of lactobacillus. You might see it at 1%, and it's entirely just one particular microbe where there's nothing else in there. Um,
interesting.
I don't consider that. I have kind of a lactobacillus, and then I have a true
Yeah.
lactobacillus that kind of removes that.
Okay. So what do you feel like um the people with autism do better when their lactobacillus is closer, like the true lactobacillus is closer to 1%, or do you find it maybe even higher?
I think 1% would probably closer to the high point.
Okay.
Honestly, if I had it around maybe 1/4%, I think I would be happy, and I think
Okay.
it could be a little challenging to kind of get there. Um, but I don't know that I've quite seen it that high, just in general, near 1% in many people. The other deficit I think too is that a lot of these kids, and typically we're looking at toddlers that are either 3 or to adults, just over 18. Most of them are on a dairy-free diet. So I
Mhm.
think the removing of the dairy component plays a big role in that, maintaining that lactobacillus. I find.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, that's all really interesting, and it's interesting to hear. Yeah, there's similar patterns to what I'm seeing in autoimmune patients, which probably, part of the underlying pathology for autism does involve a lot of inflammation. So it kind of makes sense, right? Um, so I wanted to talk to you about your protocols. So I know you set up 6-week protocols. So first I wanted to ask, I imagine with each client, you're seeing a variety of different issues. So where do you start?
So the first things to kind of consider is that you want to make sure that you have sufficient motility, and that the individual is able to have a bowel movement, at
Yeah.
least on a daily basis. And um, that might not be the case. And some individuals, they don't go for 3 or 5 days.
Hmm.
So starting an intervention really um, could be disastrous without having that motility.
Yeah.
Sometimes getting an idea of the transit time, and you can do that. I mean, there's some tricks. You can have some corn, or you can have some beets or something,
Yeah.
and try to see. That's measuring how long it takes for it to come out the other side. That gives you some perspective on what the challenge that you might have. There's some tricks and tools to help with the motility. There's a probiotic out there, Bifido lactis HN019, that I find
Hmm.
quite helpful. But there's some other things too. Um, and I think because mitochondrial dysfunction tends to be very common, that goes a certain way in terms of the peristaltic muscles in the gut kind of contracting. So once we get a handle on motility, and any bloating, might be some signs of some bacterial overgrowths in the small intestines. I think that would be my next kind of flag to make sure that um, we don't kind of aggravate anything there. But the test will give us some information on. Um, there are some supports that are built in to kind of help process, the shedding of LPS for like the
Yeah.
liver. And I think that having some flavonoids on board to help with histamine, and these kind of mast cell type reactions can be very, very helpful for. So supporting the body is really important. But once you kind of get that underlying, those tools ready, and the support and the constipation mediated, it's a combination of herbs, and then we layer on um, some prebiotics and probiotics later during those 6 weeks. And these are all positive things. So it might be something like chamomile tea, cold brewed chamomile tea, or ginger, or cinnamon, or cranberry. That are particularly specific to the overgrowths that you have based on some literature that we look at. And then feeding with prebiotics, so depending on the deficits that you have, whether you have a deficit of bifidobacteria, or we just want to kind of increase butyrate, we might use something like sun fiber or partially hydrolyzed oregon. Seems to be kind of the safest, well
Yeah.
tolerated prebiotic just in general. So just kind of regaining some of those important short chain fatty acids by that rebalancing things can be helpful. And there's some probiotics that may be specific to your particular overgrowths, and some built-in, I would say, kind of broad antifungal type components, like maybe MCT oil or a biofilm enzyme over these 6 weeks. So it kind of layers and it builds. The emphasis is that you have the power to kind of give breaks as needed. If it's too fast, it's very hard to know what the reaction and reactivity might be, particularly in the beginning. So you have those supports on board to help you out. But the interesting thing is that, because people will ask me when they get the test result back, how bad is it? And the thing that I want to convey is that, and I think this kind of pings off what the confusion might be in some of the literature. It seems that, if you're able to free up a certain amount of bandwidth in the microbiome by bringing it to a better state, whatever that improvement is, just seems to kind of go a longer way in these individuals with ASD. Because I think, they're kind of running on an empty tank, so to speak. So like I said, I like to use analogies like $1 to somebody that is poor, might not have it, is going to mean a lot more to them. So even making a small change in the microbiome might be, provide a significant amount of improvement, either in the mechanical issues or even in metabolic changes that it brings. And I've kind of realized that over time, just because sometimes when the test comes back and I'm like, okay, we got to a slightly better place, but that the individual will report these significant changes. And I'm like, whoa, this doesn't quite, I wouldn't have expected this. So I think that when you take that into consideration, freeing up that bandwidth, it really puts you in a different perspective of comparing your test to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really do that completely in the same way all of the time, depending on the total load that you have.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely see my autoimmune patients, their symptom improvement seems greater than my non-autoimmune patients. So it makes sense that for different populations, small shifts could have a large payoff.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
okay, so I'm hearing we start with kind of some support, making sure we got the motility piece, doing some support to make sure the histamine reactions aren't getting out of control with the shifts in the microbiome, dealing with the shedding of the LPS. And then you'll layer on some herbs that are kind of targeting the overgrowths. And once you're progressed with that, then layering in some prebiotics and antifungals, and the prebiotics supporting the commensals, the probiotic species like lactobacillus, butyrate producers, bifidobacterium. And then, the antifungal piece, which is, let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about how the fungal element fits into all of this.
Yeah, I think it's an unfortunate that the testing isn't quite there, or the available testing really kind of gives you limited information. But it certainly seems to be a significant piece for everyone, and some more than others. So you can get some inferences of it from symptoms, and you can get some inferences from other tests like organic acid tests or mycotoxin tests or even antibody tests. But currently right now, the options for testing are either culture, or you can do ITS or whole genome, but the databases are kind of limited. But certainly there have been some connections that I've made. In particular, this we talked about this bacterium Prevotella, and there's a ton of supporting evidence that shows that this bacteria that we find very highly overgrown feeds on fungal metabolites, and certainly I've used that as a marker to kind of um, know that there's a kind of a more of invasive or bigger fungal issue. I think that the issue is stemmed partly in the immune system, kind of being
Hmm.
able to regulate things. Um, Obviously, antibiotic use. I think biofilm is implicated as well. And some of the metabolites that are released are pretty caustic. These aldehydes, and they kind of just do a number on the liver and the body. Um, so you know, sometimes you can even see it in the stool, kind of coming out the other end, or you get hints of it. You get very kind of ammonia-y type, basic, alkaline stools and things like that. And there is a ton of literature to support, or even case studies that, when some of these children's take on even some simple antifungal type components, that they see improvement. It's kind of a mixed bag, because initially you might see some reaction or reactivity, and it could be a little jarring, but sometimes those are clear indications that something's going on. Like, I mean, if you were to take something that is, viewed as is arguably benign, like MCT oil, which is beneficial to the mitochondria and things like that, and um, the average person might not, might feel better, but initially it might have a kind of a, in terms of what it releases or what it churns up, might kind of have a little bit of a non-ideal reaction, until you kind of get to a point where you could come out the other end and it's actually pushing you into a better place. So, I don't really know why the fungal overgrowth is there completely. The antibiotics, I think there's an immune dysfunction. Um, Dysbiosis might drive it. Is it the
Hmm.
chicken or egg? But
Yeah.
it's certainly, there are so many pieces of evidence pointing that it could even be the driver of some of that microbiome, the bacterial dysbiosis.
Mm. Okay. So right now, if you're just using a 16S RNA sequencing test, if you see high Prevotella copri, that may be an indication that there's a fungal overgrowth as well. Are there any
Yeah,
other patterns in the 16S data that are kind of pointing you towards fungal?
yeah. So the other ones would be, I, I have found that the lack of the bifidobacteria seems to also implicate it, and I think it's
Interesting.
probably because of the pH regulation
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
Um, But what I often see is that sometimes when someone starts to partake in an intervention, right, that might have an antifungal broad component into it, I will usually see, on that next test, there'll be an uptick in Blaudia.
Mm.
And there's a paper out there, and I'll have to dig it up and share with you. And I think it was in either IBS or Crohn's, where they looked at correlations, um, with those diseases. And they showed that there was high fungal load and also
Hmm.
elevations in the Blaudia genus. So whenever I see that, I kind of, you know, it kind of floats through my head that we might be hitting on something. Because usually at that point we're kind of going in the right direction. But these are somewhat loose,
Yeah.
anecdotal connections that I've made there. I think the biggest indicator would just be the reaction sometimes, or the initial reaction that they might have by taking something, particularly if they never taken anything before, or you'll get the common phrase that, they don't do well on something like that,
Hmm.
which means you kind of have to support appropriately, just go slower.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let's go back to your protocols. So you're typically setting people up on the 6-week protocols, as we talked about. I'm usually doing multiple rounds, retesting between rounds. So let's talk about how people are progressing in terms of their symptoms through these different protocols. So when when are people seeing symptom improvements, and what's the progression of the symptom improvements? Are we starting with like gut stuff getting better first, or more of the behavioral things? What are your clients seeing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Some of the way that it manifests in some individuals, it's clearly like a mechanical GI. There are issues there. So constipation, or they're going several many times a day, where the stool is not formed, or they have bloating, or they are leveraging their stomach over something. So they clearly have some kind of distress from mechanical. In others, you might come to the picture, or they might have initially started doing this testing, um, somewhat reluctantly, because they're like, oh, my child goes to the bathroom and there's really no
Yeah.
noticeable GI problems. So certainly we do see improvements in those mechanical things. So we get more formed stools. If they're too frequent, we guess more regular in terms of not going 7 or 8 times a day. And obviously, if we're working on the constipation, we can help that, bloating and things like that. But what kind of comes along for the ride, which for people that are not privy to the impact of the microbiome in the body, it's a little surprising. But they could be improvements in motor coordination, cognition, verbal ability, socialization, personality. It could be even be certain symptoms that they do. So something that's quite common that you see is teeth grinding, start to minimize, or stimming start to minimize, better sleep, um, you know, better appetite. It I haven't really quite been able to like say, okay, this person is gonna get this and this person is gonna get that. We do have a survey once the 6 weeks is completed, and they fill out an evaluation, and they basically score these things, and they say, has it improved, or worsened, or is it not applicable? So, in each one of these indicators, there's improvement versus worsen. It's kind of like that. So there's overall improvement. Some people in certain items more than others, and then they kind of score the overall improvement. But, from my own personal experience with my son, I could say that, you know, um, we gained cognition, significant amounts of receptive language. There was kind of better apraxia, better ability kind of to speak there. Obviously, he started to be able to become potty trained, so because he can listen, joint attention, eye contact, the motor coordination. I remember very distinctly that when he was younger, just even walking and going up the stairs, it was kind of very much like, kind of a drunk person, so to
Hmm.
speak. And I remember when I started to kind of get into this a little bit more, we started hitting on some positive pieces that correlated with the test. I have a video on my phone where he's walking up the stairs without pulling the handrails, and I was just like utterly shocked.
Hmm.
Um, so, those are the kind of changes. Now you'll have the kind of rebuttal and say, well, that could be, typical improvement. We have several adult autistic individuals that have done the intervention, and this is well beyond the point of development, and they have also seen some of these same things. Just even doing things different. Person
Hmm.
X is now taking an interest in now he's going over and changing the channels on the TV. Um, so it certainly seems to be a positive thing on multiple different levels. And I think if you do some other testing, you'd find out too that metabolic dysfunction would likely show improvement as well.
Hmm. Okay, so once you've gotten people through a couple of rounds and you're seeing the microbiome look much more towards that middle guy, what are the next steps then? What kind of maintenance are you doing to help these individuals kind of maintain their microbiome balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's my personal view is, I think that to kind of get out of the hole, you need some level of maintenance, probably for at least a period of 2 years, and
Hmm.
it might not be as exhaustive as taking this 7 herbs and 3 probiotics and some prebiotics on a daily basis or something like that. But I think that to kind of rebuild, um, you know, so how could the issue continue to drive itself? We know that the brain can impact the gut, and the gut can impact the brain. Right? People that get brain injuries have been shown to have
Yeah.
dysbiosis, and I think the mucosa, the lining of the gut, really is that kind of mediating pathway of inflaming, stirring up autoimmunity, and potentially driving this big feedback loop. And I think it takes a long time to recover that and to rebuild that if it was damaged.
Hmm.
It's not even this, we think of like the stool test, we're getting all of these microbes in one swab. It's a three-dimensional problem, right? It's not only one piece of the colon, it's the entire colon. And then the layering of the mucosa of kind of how the microbes live in there is really integral to kind of having things kind of function normally. You don't have that hyperpermeability. So I think that takes a long time to really, so seal up all of the leaks and get things in check. So I think a low maintenance of maybe a prebiotic, a probiotic, and a rotation of some positive, you know, gut herbs for a while would be a smart thing to do. And that's kind of the fear in the back of my mind that, hey, these are positive things. Things like chamomile tea and mastic gum. Certainly, they've been used for thousands of years for gut issues. It's probably not a good idea. It probably is a good idea to just keep them in the mix at some point. And I think that a lot of people will ask me, well, what about the diet?
Yeah.
Because the 6 weeks tends to be a little intensive, and these individuals tend to be a little bit picky. I tend to not focus on it so much in the beginning, but I say that once you get past that third round, I think now we really need to make some significant attempts to kind of diversify what they're eating. So some tricks and some tools and tips for that. What I tell people is get a blender, um, and start making some shakes, right? A lot of the population is averse to milk products, but you can use coconut yogurts or almond yogurts. Put in some veggies, put in some fruits, blend it. You can even freeze it in an ice cube tray and keep it. Do this on one Sunday for a couple of hours. You get this whole ice cube tray of mixed vegetables, and then you can add that on a daily basis to a shake, and you really kind of bring on different foods that might not be in the diet. Eat something different, right?
Yeah.
You don't eat the same thing all the time. Even though something might be good, if you kind of binge on it, there's certainly not good to do.
Yeah. Not getting that diversity response in the microbiome for sure. Um, yeah, definitely the doing what we can with the diet, obviously going to be somewhat limited based on, the individual's preferences and all that. But it kind of brings me to a point where in some of the research, they're basically suggesting that the reason why the microbiome is out of balance in people with autism is because they are consuming a limited diet. So basically, the microbiome imbalances are a symptom of one of the features of autism and not really playing a role. But that doesn't really make sense to me because obviously, you're seeing changes with symptoms in when you change the microbiome. But I think there's a lot of times we look at the microbiome very linearly, like, okay, diet is going to impact microbiome, and then microbiome will impact these different health features. But there's also some internal factors of the host are going to circle back and impact the microbiome. So um, I'm curious as to your experience with individuals who are eating what you would think would be a really healthy, supportive diet for the microbiome, and how that is impacting their symptoms and their microbiome and what's going on there.
Yes, certainly, I would say it's not the dominant kind of pool of individuals, but there are certainly a lot of them that eat a very good healthy diet, and they still have these non-ideal features in the microbiome.
Yeah.
One of the counters to that, I think, quite immediately is that I've seen some infant biomes, that are either 6 months, 8 months, 18 months individuals. And in particular, I've seen some very crazy, in two of them, they had Prevotella copri overgrowths that were taking, 50, 70% of their biome at 8 months,
Yeah.
at 16 months, at 18 months. I mean, these are infants that are just being breastfed, or, maybe they're getting formula, but they're not even eating at that point. So
Yeah.
the diet is not even, um, and, some of these things are not explained by diet. Like in the
Mhm.
case of Prevotella copri and some of the individuals, they have the exact opposite diet that the literature would suggest
Yeah.
that would kind of promote that overgrowth. So I certainly think it plays a role, and but there seems to be some forcing function that is driving things, or something else kind of explaining it, where I think the diet's role is kind of keeping things working and keeping things at bay once you have it
Yeah.
in a reasonable place. But I don't know that you can quite get there completely with diet. If you can, then more power to you. Let me know what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm curious to know, so once somebody is in maintenance, let's say for some reason they do suffer another microbiome insult, like they have to take a course of antibiotics. Are you seeing return of symptoms?
Yeah, and we the with antibiotics. So it's often that antibiotics are prescribed like kind of candy,
Yeah.
and it scares me a lot. So there's the implication that the fungal component can come back, or can worsen. I try to tell the parents that, be smart about it. Don't not see the doctor, or don't not take your antibiotic. Obviously, you want to listen to your professional. But use your kind of common sense. If it's an ear infection, might you be able to get away with with antibiotics that are localized to the ear?
Hmm.
Certainly I wish that we would have done that for my son, instead of giving
Hmm.
him 5 courses of oral antibiotics before the age of 2 for ear infections. Um, so yeah, I personally would just, you know try to include some positive things. I think one of the deficits, just in general, with Western medicine, or just, going to the pediatrician, it's never discussed, or it's never told you after you have these antibiotics to do anything positive for your gut. There's no prescriptive probiotic that comes along
Hmm.
with it, and there should be. And we know that these things, wreak havoc on the microbiome. I mean, I even tell people that have taken antibiotics recently that, don't even do the stool test for at least 2 or 3 months, because
Yeah.
things are just changing so dynamically. We're going to get a non-representative piece of information. Um, so it's certainly a challenge. I think antibiotics are prescribed, even compared to antifungals. I think that they're prescribed. Like, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
you have a UTI. How do you know that it's bacterial? Um, I'm not saying to go take an antifungal, but there's a lot of nasal sinus infections. The dominant lead, I think there's a paper out there that said that the most common infection is actually fungal and not
Yeah.
bacterial. So are we just driving this? Are we just making things worse? I think constantly you'll see the literature on how this Candida auris, is this pathogenic candidas, are almost impossible to eradicate in hospital settings.
Hmm.
It used to be C. diff now, and I think now the fungal piece is going to take over. So,
Lovely.
yeah, challenging, and do your homework, stay on top of things, text when you can, when it's appropriately, and just include some probiotics in there that might help to mitigate the blow.
Hmm. All right. Well, I think that was it for my questions. Um, any other thoughts? Anything else you want to share with us?
Yeah, so I just wanted to comment and say that to thank so much to Biomesight for having this, and I know that they understand the importance of this, and um, how helpful it can be in improving overall someone's health. And I think they get that picture there. And I think the 16S test is really an affordable
Yeah.
way to really figure out what's going on. I mean, the majority of our literature is really based on that 16S type testing. You can get a good understanding of what's going on in the phylogenetic hierarchy. And I think it's just, if you're having some kind of medical component issue in your life, it pays to do this kind of test once
Mhm.
and see what's going on. Because I think that this connection with the gut and health has now been um, really solidified in so many different diseases: cancer, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's. I mean, all of these things are just showing that there's some kind of non-ideal dysbiosis going on.
Absolutely.
And there's evidence to show that when you tweak the microbiome, that you can see improvements. So don't look at it in terms of as this is the answer for everything, but it might be a significant piece of the pie in helping you to regain some health or keep that health. And we're constantly taking insults from the environment, foods, whatever's in there,
Yeah.
whatever we're surrounded by, and I think this is a big lack or missing piece just in medicine in general. And
Mhm.
probably if we went into the future, 1 or 2 decades, I think everyone's going to be talking about, well, why weren't we doing this sooner? And
Oh, yeah.
you know, so thanks to Biomesight for having this, and appreciate all their help.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. That was really interesting.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Polland. Nice talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the Biomesight podcast. Please go to biomesight.com to learn more about microbiome testing for patients and practitioners. Please see the show notes for additional resources and information about our guest.